For 3,000 years, the Galactic Council had ruled with absolute authority over 2 million star systems. No species had ever dared to defy their decrees. No civilization had ever survived their wrath when they chose rebellion over submission. The Council's word was law, written in the ashes of countless worlds that had forgotten their place in the cosmic hierarchy. But humanity had always been different. They were the only species that laughed in the face of impossible odds. The only beings who saw inevitable defeat as merely another challenge to overcome. And, on the day they stood up from their seats in the Grand Assembly, pushed back their chairs with deliberate slowness, and walked toward the exit while the entire galaxy watched in stunned silence, that was the day everything changed forever. What followed would reshape the very foundations of galactic civilization, proving that sometimes the greatest power isn't in the weapons you carry or the fleets you command, it's in the courage to say no when the entire universe expects you to bow. 4 Ambassador Sarah Chen had seen many things in her 45 years representing humanity in the Galactic Council, but she had never seen fear quite like this. The massive crystalline chamber that housed the Grand Assembly buzzed with nervous energy as delegates from across the galaxy whispered among themselves in dozens of languages. The air recyclers worked overtime to accommodate the various atmospheric requirements of 200 different species, creating an almost metallic taste that Sarah had grown accustomed to over her 15 years of service. The Zephyrian delegate, whose blue-scaled hide normally shimmered with confidence, kept glancing toward the human section with something that could only be described as apprehension. The normally boisterous Caraxian representatives sat in unusual silence, their multiple eyes occasionally darting toward Sarah and her small team of advisors. Even the ancient ethereal council members, who claimed to have transcended physical emotion millions of years ago, seemed to emanate an uncomfortable tension through their translucent forms. Sarah adjusted her simple black suit, a stark contrast to the elaborate robes, ceremonial armor, and bioluminescent displays worn by other delegates. Humanity had always preferred simplicity in their diplomatic attire, a choice that many species initially interpreted as a sign of primitiveness. They had learned otherwise over the past 3 decades since first contact. The reason for today's emergency session sat before them all in the form of a holographic display showing the Kepler 442 system. What had once been home to the peaceful Valdorian civilization now appeared as nothing more than dead rock and cooling gas. 15 billion lives, snuffed out in less than 12 hours by the Council's enforcement fleet. The official reason was failure to comply with Galactic Trade Regulation 447C, though everyone in the chamber knew the real reason was far simpler: the Valdorians had dared to question the Council's authority. High Counselor Thexbar, a being whose species had evolved from predatory hunters on a world where survival meant killing or being killed, rose from his elevated platform. His 6 arms gestured dramatically as his voice boomed through the translation matrix, reaching every delegate in their native tongue. "Let the fate of the Valdorians serve as a reminder to all present," Thexbar declared, his serpentine form coiling with practiced menace. "The Galactic Council has maintained peace and order for 3 millennia. We have done so through strength, through unity, and through the understanding that some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. The Valdorians chose chaos over order. They chose defiance over cooperation. They chose extinction over wisdom." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. The hegemony representatives, whose militaristic culture valued strength above all else, clicked their mandibles in approval. The collective delegates, beings who shared a hive mind across their entire species, pulsed with synchronized bioluminescence that served as their version of applause. However, Thexbar continued, his compound eyes sweeping across the chamber, "We gather today not merely to discuss the consequences of rebellion, but to address a far more pressing concern. Intelligence reports indicate that certain, influential, species have been quietly questioning the necessity of recent enforcement actions. Some have even gone so far as to suggest alternative approaches to maintaining galactic stability." The temperature in Sarah's section seemed to drop several degrees. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward the human delegation. This wasn't coincidence. The entire session had been orchestrated to send a message, and humanity was clearly the intended recipient. Dr. Marcus Webb, Sarah's chief scientific advisor, leaned forward in his seat. His weathered hands gripped the armrests of his chair as he whispered urgently, "Sarah, my contacts in the Tau Ceti research stations have been reporting unusual fleet movements for the past week. This isn't just about the Valdorians. They're positioning for something bigger." Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly. She had suspected as much from the moment they received the emergency session notice. The council had grown increasingly aggressive over the past decade, using the pretense of maintaining order to crush any sign of independent thought among member species. What had once been a cooperative alliance of civilizations had gradually transformed into a rigid hierarchy where questioning the council's decisions was tantamount to treason. The humans have been particularly vocal in their concerns regarding recent council decisions, Thexbar said, his voice carrying across the chamber with deliberate emphasis. Ambassador Chen, perhaps you would care to share your thoughts on the Valdorian situation with the Assembly? Sarah rose slowly from her seat, feeling the collective gaze of the galaxy upon her. She had prepared for this moment, though she had hoped it would never come. In her hand, she held a small data pad containing humanity's formal response to 3 decades of gradual oppression disguised as galactic cooperation. High Counselor, she began, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment, humanity has always believed in the principles upon which the Galactic Council was founded. Peace, cooperation, mutual benefit, and the protection of all sentient life. However, what we witnessed in the Kepler 442 system was not justice. It was not enforcement of reasonable regulations. It was the systematic annihilation of an entire civilization for the crime of asking questions. The chamber fell silent. Even the constant hum of the life support systems seemed to quiet as Sarah's words hung in the air. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Meridian representative, whose species prized diplomatic neutrality above all else, began making subtle hand gestures that Sarah recognized as their equivalent of nervous fidgeting. The Valdorians, Sarah continued, requested a review of Trade Regulation 447C because it effectively forced them to abandon their traditional agricultural practices in favor of council-approved synthetic alternatives. They asked for a gradual transition period to avoid economic collapse. They submitted formal proposals for compromise solutions. They followed every proper diplomatic channel. And, for this, they were labeled as rebels and eliminated. High Counselor Thexbar's form seemed to expand slightly, a sign of agitation in his species. Ambassador Chen, you speak as if the council acted without justification. The Valdorians were given multiple opportunities to comply with necessary regulations designed to maintain galactic stability. Their continued defiance left us no choice but to commit genocide, Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. The collective gasp that followed was audible even through the translation matrix. No delegate had ever interrupted a High Counselor during a formal session. The breach of protocol was so severe that several species representatives began frantically checking their cultural databases to determine the appropriate response. I beg your pardon? Thexbar's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his previous booming declarations. Sarah looked directly at the High Counselor, her brown eyes meeting his compound gaze without flinching. 15 billion sentient beings are dead, High Counselor. Not soldiers who chose to fight. Not rebels who took up arms. Farmers, teachers, children, elderly beings who had never left their home planets. They died because they asked for reasonable accommodation to regulations that would have destroyed their way of life. If that isn't genocide, then, perhaps the Council needs to revisit its definition of the term. The chamber erupted into chaos. Delegates began shouting in dozens of languages, some supporting Sarah's words, others condemning her for such blatant disrespect. The hegemony representatives were on their feet, their armored forms bristling with barely contained aggression. The collective synchronized bioluminescence flickered wildly as they processed the implications of the human statement. Dr. Webb and the rest of the human delegation remained seated, their faces calm despite the storm of controversy surrounding them. They had known this moment would come eventually. Humanity had spent decades watching the Council slowly transform from protector to oppressor, and they had finally reached their breaking point. High Counselor Thexbar raised all 6 arms, and the chamber's sound dampeners activated, forcing silence upon the assembly. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority that had cowed species across the galaxy for 3,000 years. Ambassador Chen, he said slowly, you forget yourself. You forget your place. The human species joined the Galactic Council 32 years ago as a junior member. You were granted representation out of curiosity about your species' unique characteristics, not because you had earned a voice in galactic affairs. Your planet is barely out of its industrial age by galactic standards. Your people have not even achieved true interstellar travel without our assistance. And yet you dare to question decisions made by civilizations that had mastered space travel before your species discovered fire. Sarah felt a cold fury building in her chest, but her voice remained steady. Age does not grant wisdom, High Counselor. And technological advancement does not provide moral authority. Yes, humanity is young compared to the great civilizations represented here. But perhaps that youth gives us clarity that age has obscured. We see the Council for what it has become, not what it once was. And what, Thexvar asked with dangerous quiet, has the Council become in your enlightened human perspective? A tyranny, Sarah replied without hesitation. A regime that maintains power through fear and eliminates dissent through violence. You speak of maintaining order, but true order cannot be built on the foundation of mass graves. You talk of unity, but unity achieved through the threat of extinction is not unity at all, it is submission enforced by terror. The chamber had become so quiet that the sound of individual breathing could be heard through the atmospheric systems. Even the most diplomatic species present seemed stunned by the directness of Sarah's accusations. In 3 millennia of council history, no delegate had ever spoken with such open defiance to the ruling body. High Counselor Thexvar's form began to shift colors, cycling through the aggressive display patterns that had once terrified prey species on his homeworld. Ambassador Chen, you are dangerously close to crossing a line from which there is no return. The Council has been patient with human peculiarities, but our patience is not infinite. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position before you follow the path of the Valdorians. The threat was clear, and every being in the chamber understood its implications. But, instead of backing down, Sarah reached into her jacket and withdrew the data pad she had been carrying. The small device seemed insignificant in the vast chamber, but every delegate recognized the formal seal of the United Earth government displayed on its screen. High Counselor, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the silent chamber, I have here a formal communication from the United Earth government, endorsed by every major nation and colony world in human space. It outlines humanity's position regarding the current direction of Galactic Council policies and our response to the threats implicit in today's proceedings. She activated the datapad, and her next words would be remembered throughout galactic history as the moment everything changed. The human species formally rejects the authority of the Galactic Council to determine the fate of sentient civilizations through threat of force. We withdraw our recognition of Council sovereignty over matters of internal planetary governance and declare our intention to offer protection to any species seeking alternatives to Council membership. Effective immediately, the Sol system and all human colonies are closing their borders to Council enforcement fleets. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the mechanical systems seemed to pause as the full weight of Sarah's declaration settled upon the assembly. No species in galactic history had ever voluntarily withdrawn from Council authority. The very concept was so unprecedented that most civilizations had no legal or cultural framework for understanding it. High Counselor Thexvar's color display had shifted to deep crimson, a pattern that among his species indicated a threat response so severe that it typically preceded immediate violence. Ambassador Chen, he said, each word carrying the weight of barely controlled fury, what you describe is not withdrawal. It is rebellion. It is treason against the established order of galactic civilization. And it will be dealt with accordingly. Sarah nodded calmly, as if she had expected exactly this response. Then, let me be perfectly clear about humanity's position, High Counselor. We are not rebels. We are not traitors. We are simply beings who refuse to participate in a system that has abandoned its founding principles in favor of authoritarian control. If the Council chooses to interpret our withdrawal as rebellion, that is your decision. But, understand this, humanity will not go quietly into extinction like the Valdorians. She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the statement that would echo through history. We are not the same species that joined this Council 32 years ago. We have learned much during our time here, not just about advanced technology or galactic politics, but about ourselves. We have discovered that there are some things worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. And we have realized that sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply saying no when the entire universe expects you to say yes. The human delegation rose as one, their movements synchronized but unhurried. Sarah tucked the data pad back into her jacket and straightened her shoulders. The human delegation formally withdraws from these proceedings and from the Galactic Council itself. We will be departing immediately. As the humans began to move toward the chamber's exit, the assembly remained frozen in shock. No one seemed capable of processing what they had just witnessed. The concept of voluntary withdrawal from the council was so alien that most species literally had no word for it in their languages. But, as Sarah and her team reached the great doors that led from the assembly chamber, High Counselor Thexbar found his voice again. His words followed them like a curse. No species survives outside the council's protection, Ambassador Chen. The galaxy is vast and dangerous, and humanity is still too young and weak to stand alone. You will learn this lesson, just as every other species has learned it over the past 3 millennia. You will return to us, humbled and broken, begging for readmission to the order you so carelessly abandoned today. Sarah paused at the threshold and turned back toward the assembly one final time. Her voice carried clearly across the chamber, reaching every delegate present. High Counselor, you may be right. Humanity may not survive what comes next. But, if we fall, we will fall as free beings who chose our own destiny rather than living as slaves who accepted the destiny imposed upon us by others. And, perhaps that example will inspire others to question whether survival at any cost is truly worth the price you demand. With that, the human delegation walked through the great doors and disappeared from view, leaving behind 3,000 years of established galactic order and stepping into an uncertain future that would test everything they believed about themselves and their place in the universe. In the chamber they left behind, silence reigned for long moments before the whispered conversations began. Some delegates spoke of human foolishness and inevitable destruction. Others wondered quietly whether the humans had seen something the rest of the galaxy had missed. And a few began to consider possibilities they had never dared to contemplate before. The age of unquestioned council authority had ended the moment the humans walked out. What would replace it remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the galaxy would never be the same again. The journey back to human space felt different than any Ambassador Sarah Chen had ever taken. The diplomatic transport Unity's voice cut through hyperspace toward the Sol system, its engines humming with the quiet efficiency that had become humanity's trademark in ship design. But the usual sense of routine that accompanied interstellar travel was absent, replaced by an electric tension that seemed to permeate every bulkhead and corridor. Dr. Marcus Webb stood before the large viewport in the ship's observation lounge, watching the swirling patterns of hyperspace with unusual intensity. His reflection in the transparent aluminum showed a man who had aged years in the span of hours, the weight of what they had just done etching new lines around his eyes. Second thoughts, Marcus? Sarah asked as she entered the lounge, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. The simple beverage had become something of a human signature throughout the galaxy, though most species found the concept of consuming a stimulant derived from ground plant seeds to be bizarre. Marcus accepted the cup with a grateful nod. Not about what we did, he said carefully. About what happens next. The mathematical models my team has been running are sobering. The Council has never faced organized resistance from a member species. Their response protocols are all based on the assumption that defiance means immediate military suppression. Sarah settled into one of the lounge's comfortable chairs, designed with human ergonomics in mind rather than the one-size-fits-all approach used in most council facilities. You're worried they'll try to make an example of us like they did with the Valdorians. I'm worried about something much worse than that, Marcus replied, turning away from the viewport. The Valdorians were never council members. They were a protected species under the Expansion Accords, which gave the council certain rights to intervene in their affairs but also placed limitations on the scope of that intervention. We're full members who just declared independence. According to council law, we're not rebels, we're traitors to galactic civilization itself. Sarah sipped her coffee thoughtfully. She had been ambassador long enough to understand the subtle but crucial differences in galactic law that Marcus was referencing. The Council's legal framework had evolved over millennia to handle every conceivable situation except the one they had just created. Which means they have legal justification for. She began. Complete eradication, Marcus finished grimly. Not just our military forces or our governments, but our entire species. Under the betrayal protocols established after the Nexari uprising 12 centuries ago, traitorous council members can be declared a threat to galactic stability and eliminated entirely. The weight of that statement settled between them like a physical presence. Sarah had known the risks when she made her declaration, but hearing the legal specifics laid out so starkly brought home just how precarious humanity's position had become. They had approximately 18 days before their ship reached Sol System, and, by then, the Council's response would likely already be in motion. However, Marcus continued, a slight smile breaking through his worried expression, there's something the Council doesn't know about. Something we've been keeping very quiet for the past 8 years. Sarah raised an eyebrow. As ambassador, she was supposed to be briefed on all major human developments that might affect galactic relations. Marcus, if you're about to tell me that Earth has been hiding some kind of secret weapon technology, I'm going to be very upset that no one thought to mention this during our withdrawal planning sessions. Not a weapon, Marcus said, his smile widening. Something much better. Something the Council has never seen before and won't know how to counter. He activated his personal datapad and showed Sarah a series of technical schematics that meant nothing to her diplomatic training but clearly excited him immensely. The Prometheus Project, he explained. 8 years ago, our scientists at the Jupiter Research Station made a breakthrough in quantum field manipulation that we've been very carefully not sharing with the Council. We've developed a way to create stable micro-wormholes for instantaneous communication and transportation across any distance. Sarah stared at the schematics, her mind racing through the implications. Marcus, that's impossible. The Council's best scientists have been working on quantum communication for centuries. They've managed to reduce transmission lag to a few hours across galactic distances, but instantaneous communication requires energy expenditures that would drain entire star systems. That's because they've been approaching the problem wrong, Marcus said with obvious pride. They've been trying to brute force their way through the quantum barriers using massive energy inputs. We discovered that you don't need to break through the barriers, you need to convince them to let you through. He pulled up another schematic showing what appeared to be a ring-like device covered in intricate geometric patterns. Consciousness-guided quantum tunneling. Human intuition and creativity, it turns out, can navigate quantum probability matrices in ways that pure computational power cannot. We don't force the wormholes open, we ask the universe nicely and provide it with interesting patterns to follow. Sarah felt her coffee growing cold as she stared at the implications of what Marcus was showing her. How many people know about this? On Earth? Maybe 300. Scattered across our colonies? Another 100 or so. We've been very careful to compartmentalize the information. The Council monitors all our communications, but they've never thought to monitor human consciousness directly. Marcus paused, then added with a grin, turns out that assuming we're too primitive to develop advanced technology has some unexpected benefits. The ambassador was already thinking through the strategic possibilities when the ship's communication system chimed with an incoming message. The voice of Captain Rodriguez, Unity's voice commanding officer, came through the speakers with barely controlled excitement. Ambassador Chen, Dr. Webb, you need to get up to the bridge immediately. We're receiving priority communications from Earth, and the transmission delay is, well, it's impossible. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances before hurrying toward the bridge. When they arrived, they found Captain Rodriguez staring at her communication console with the expression of someone whose understanding of physics had just been fundamentally challenged. Captain, what's the situation? Sarah asked. Ma'am, we just received a real-time communication from Earth. Not delayed by our current distance, not routed through Council relay stations. Real-time, as in sent 3 seconds ago and received 3 seconds ago. Rodriguez paused, then added, according to our instruments, we're currently 16 light-years from Sol System. That message should have taken 16 years to reach us. Marcus moved to one of the bridge workstations and began pulling up technical readings. The Prometheus network is online, he announced with satisfaction. While we've been dealing with the Council, the folks back home have been busy installing quantum communication nodes throughout human space. Sarah, we're not as isolated as the Council thinks we are. The main view screen activated, showing the familiar face of President Elena Vasquez in the Oval Office of the United Earth Government. Despite the impossible distance separating them, the image was crystal clear and showed no signs of transmission lag. Ambassador Chen, President Vasquez began without preamble, "I trust your journey home is proceeding smoothly. We've been monitoring Council communications since your departure, and I'm afraid the news isn't particularly encouraging." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "What's the Council's response, Madam President?" High Counselor Thexbar has called for an emergency session of the Inner Circle to discuss what he's terming the human betrayal. Intelligence suggests they'll be voting on whether to invoke the betrayal protocols within the next 48 hours. If they do. President Vasquez paused meaningfully. "Complete species eradication," Sarah finished. "Yes, Dr. Webb briefed me on the legal implications. Do we have any indication of how the vote might go?" "That's where things get interesting," President Vasquez said, leaning forward in her chair. "It seems our little walkout has had some unexpected consequences. 3 species have formally requested private meetings with Council leadership to discuss concerns about recent enforcement policies. 2 more have filed official complaints about the Valdorian genocide. And the Meridian Confederation has done something unprecedented, they've abstained from supporting the emergency session entirely." Marcus looked up from his workstation with surprise. "The Meridians abstained?" "They've supported every Council decision for the past 800 years. It gets better," President Vasquez continued. "Our intelligence sources indicate that several major species are quietly questioning whether the Council's response to our withdrawal might be setting a dangerous precedent. Apparently, some of them are beginning to wonder what constitutes betrayal if simply leaving the organization peacefully qualifies." Sarah felt a spark of hope beginning to build in her chest. "They're realizing that if the Council can eliminate us for withdrawal, they could theoretically eliminate any species for any reason the Council deems treasonous." "Exactly," President Vasquez confirmed. "But here's the really interesting part. The Kethmoran Empire has sent a secret communication requesting a private meeting with human representatives. They want to discuss mutual interests regarding galactic governance structures." The bridge fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. The Kethmoran Empire controlled nearly 40 star systems and possessed one of the largest military fleets in Council space. They were also known for their fierce independence and had frequently clashed with the Council over territorial rights and trade regulations. "They want to ally with us," Sarah said slowly. "They see our withdrawal as an opportunity to challenge Council authority themselves." "It appears so," President Vasquez agreed. "Which brings me to the main reason for this communication. Ambassador, I'm authorizing you to alter your course and meet with the Kethmoran representatives at the neutral station at Kepler 186f. Dr. Webb, I need you to brief them on the Prometheus project. If we're going to survive what's coming, we're going to need allies, and we're going to need them to understand that humanity has capabilities the Council hasn't anticipated." Marcus nodded grimly. "The quantum communication network is just the beginning, Madam President. We've also made significant advances in defensive technologies, resource extraction, and what we're calling cooperative consciousness applications. If we can convince the Kethmorans that we're not just naive rebels making a doomed gesture, we might be able to build something the galaxy has never seen before. A coalition of independent species," Sarah mused. "Not bound by Council authority but capable of defending themselves against Council aggression." "The Council has ruled through fear for 3 millennia, President Vasquez said. "But fear only works if your victims believe resistance is impossible. We've proven that withdrawal is possible. If we can prove that survival after withdrawal is possible, we might inspire others to follow our example." Captain Rodriguez had been quietly monitoring her instruments throughout the conversation. She looked up with concern evident on her face. "Ambassador, I'm detecting movement in hyperspace. Multiple large objects on an intercept course with our current trajectory." Marcus immediately moved to the tactical station and began analyzing the sensor readings. "Council enforcement fleet," he announced grimly. 12 heavy cruisers, 6 battle destroyers, and what appears to be a Nexus-class command vessel. They're running silent, but our quantum sensors can detect their mass displacement patterns. Sarah felt her blood run cold. A fleet that size could sterilize entire star systems. "Time to intercept?" Approximately 14 hours at current velocity, Captain Rodriguez replied. They must have launched the moment we left Council space. President Vasquez's voice cut through the tension on the bridge. Ambassador, you need to reach the Kethmoran meeting point. Captain Rodriguez, I'm authorizing emergency protocols. Dr. Webb, it's time to field test the Prometheus defensive systems. Marcus's fingers flew over his workstation as he began activating systems that Sarah hadn't even known were installed on their ship. Quantum displacement field generators coming online. Consciousness-guided evasion protocols initialized. Sarah, you might want to hold on to something. What we're about to do is going to feel very strange. The ship around them began to hum with a frequency that seemed to resonate directly with Sarah's nervous system. It wasn't quite a sound and wasn't quite a vibration, but something that seemed to exist at the intersection of both. The view screen showing President Vasquez flickered momentarily, then stabilized with even clearer resolution than before. The Council is about to learn something important about humanity, President Vasquez said, her image somehow conveying both determination and concern across the impossible distance. We're not the primitive species they think we are. We've spent 32 years in the galactic community learning, growing, and developing capabilities they've never imagined. Today, we find out if that's enough. Captain Rodriguez activated the ship's quantum displacement systems, and Unity's voice simply ceased to exist in normal spacetime. For a brief moment that seemed to last forever, Sarah experienced the sensation of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Then, reality reasserted itself, and they were 16 light-years away from their previous position, safely within the neutral zone surrounding Kepler 186f. Behind them, a Council enforcement fleet found empty space where their target should have been. Their instruments showed no trace of the human ship's passage, no residual energy signatures that might indicate the method of their escape. For the first time in millennia, a Council fleet had completely lost track of their quarry. In the command center of the Nexus-class vessel Eternal Order, Fleet Commander ZYX Andrus stared at his tactical displays with growing unease. His species had evolved from pack hunters who tracked prey across continents spanning territories, and the complete absence of any trail was deeply disturbing to his fundamental instincts. Communications officer, he commanded in the harsh clicking language of his people, transmit a priority message to High Counselor Thexvar. The human vessel has disappeared using unknown technology. No trace of passage detected. Recommend immediate escalation of threat assessment protocols. As the message raced toward Council space through conventional hyperspace relays, ZYX Andrus continued to stare at his empty tactical display. In his species' long history of hunting, they had learned that prey which disappeared completely was infinitely more dangerous than prey that simply ran fast. The humans had just demonstrated that they were no longer prey at all. Aboard Unity's voice, now safely within the neutral zone, Sarah looked at the tactical display showing their pursuers' confused search patterns. How long before they realize we're not just hiding? They'll figure out we've left the area entirely within the next few hours, Marcus replied. But they'll never figure out how we did it. The quantum displacement system leaves no residual signatures in normal spacetime. Which means they'll have to report to the Council that the humans possess transportation technology beyond anything in their databases, Sarah mused. That should make for an interesting conversation. President Vasquez's image on the viewscreen smiled grimly. Ambassador, you have 48 hours before the Council votes on the betrayal protocols. Use that time wisely. The future of human independence may depend on what you can accomplish with the Kethmorans. As the communication link ended, Sarah stared out at the stars of the neutral zone. Somewhere among those distant lights, representatives of the Kethmoran Empire were waiting to learn whether humanity was worth the risk of defying the most powerful organization in galactic history. The answer to that question would determine whether the galaxy continued under Council rule or began a new age of independent cooperation among free species. Sarah had 18 hours to convince the Kethmorans that humanity was not just another doomed rebellion, but the beginning of something the galaxy had never seen before. The future of galactic civilization was about to be decided in a conference room on a remote neutral station, and Ambassador Sarah Chen was carrying the hopes of every species that had ever dreamed of freedom from Council control. The neutral station at Kepler 186f had been built specifically for meetings that required absolute neutrality, a place where no single species' cultural or technological advantages could influence negotiations. Its stark, geometric architecture reflected no particular aesthetic, and its life support systems had been designed to accommodate virtually any known form of sentient life. Ambassador Sarah Chen found the sterile environment oddly comforting as she prepared for what might be the most important diplomatic meeting in human history. The Kethmoran delegation had arrived 12 hours earlier aboard a ship that defied easy classification. Unlike the sleek, efficient designs favored by most species, Kethmoran vessels looked like they had been grown rather than built, their organic curves and flowing lines suggesting a technology based on biological principles rather than mechanical engineering. The living wind hung in space near the station like an enormous sea creature, its bioluminescent hull patterns shifting in complex displays that Dr. Webb's instruments indicated were actually sophisticated communication arrays. Their technology is fascinating, Marcus said as he reviewed the latest sensor readings from their quantum analysis systems. They're not just using biological materials in their construction, they're using actual living organisms as integral components of their ship systems. The hull isn't just shaped like a creature, parts of it actually are a creature. Sarah nodded absently as she reviewed her diplomatic briefing materials. The Kethmorans were one of the oldest species in the galaxy, predating even the Council's formation by several million years. They had joined the galactic community relatively recently, only about 800 years ago, and had maintained a reputation for fierce independence and technological innovation that followed paths completely different from mainstream galactic science. What do we know about their motivations for requesting this meeting? She asked. According to our intelligence sources, Marcus replied, the Kethmorans have been increasingly frustrated with Council trade policies that restrict their access to certain types of biological resources. They've also been quietly developing defensive technologies that the Council considers potentially destabilizing to galactic security. Captain Rodriguez entered the station's meeting room where Sarah and Marcus had been preparing. Ambassador, the Kethmoran delegation is requesting permission to board. Their message was unusual. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Unusual how? They didn't use standard diplomatic protocols or even standard galactic trade language, Rodriguez explained. The message was transmitted in mathematical sequences that our computers interpreted as expressing concepts like curiosity-driven gathering and pattern recognition exchange. It's like they're approaching this entire meeting from a fundamentally different conceptual framework. That's actually encouraging, Marcus said with interest. The Kethmorans are known for thinking in ways that other species find difficult to follow. If they're approaching our situation from their own unique perspective, they might see possibilities that more conventional species would miss. Sarah stood and straightened her formal diplomatic attire. Let's find out what they have in mind. Captain, please extend our invitation for them to board at their convenience. The Kethmoran delegation that entered the meeting room 30 minutes later was unlike anything Sarah had encountered in her years of galactic diplomacy. The three beings moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the station's artificial gravity, their elongated forms covered in what appeared to be a combination of natural skin and technological augmentations that seamlessly blended organic and artificial elements. The lead delegate introduced herself as Growth Pattern Seeker Velandith, a title that Dr. Webb's translation software struggled to render into human concepts. Her companions were identified as Resource Flow Coordinator HYXmoth and Possibility Walker Zethune, names that suggested the Kethmorans organized themselves around functional capabilities rather than traditional hierarchical structures. Curious pattern humans, Velandith said, her voice carrying harmonic overtones that created an almost musical quality to her words. Your withdrawal action creates ripple effects through stability patterns that Council entity cannot comprehend. We observe. We analyze. We discover synchronization opportunities. Sarah found herself having to consciously adjust her thinking patterns to follow the Kethmoran communication style. Growth Pattern Seeker Velandith, humanity appreciates your willingness to meet with us. We understand that your species has also experienced friction with Council policies. Council entity operates from fear-based limitation patterns, Velandith replied, settling into a chair that immediately began adapting its shape to accommodate her unique physiology. Growth requires exploration risk. Discovery requires pattern breaking. Council entity prevents both through stability obsession. Dr. Webb leaned forward with obvious interest. Your species approaches technological development through biological integration rather than mechanical manipulation, correct? The Council has been restricting your access to genetic material from certain species? HYX the Resource Flow Coordinator, responded with what appeared to be approval. Council entity fears growth potential beyond their comprehension boundaries. They classify our biological integration as dangerous unpredictable. We classify their mechanical limitations as growth preventive stagnation. But humanity demonstrates new pattern possibility, added Zethune, the possibility walker. Your species achieves impossible transportation, impossible communication. Council entity cannot explain, cannot control, cannot predict. Sarah realized that the Kethmorans had somehow detected the quantum displacement technology that had allowed Unity's voice to escape the Council fleet. You're aware of our technological capabilities? We observe quantum pattern fluctuations that suggest consciousness-guided probability manipulation, Velandith confirmed. Your species achieves symbiosis harmony between biological intuition and quantum mechanics. Similar to our biological technology integration but following different pathway development. Marcus's eyes lit up with excitement. You're saying that our approach to quantum consciousness applications is similar to your biological integration techniques, just using different methods? Convergent evolution toward harmony-based technology, HYX agreed. Council entity cannot comprehend because they separate consciousness from technology, biology from mechanics, intuition from logic. Both our species transcend these artificial separation limitations. Sarah felt a growing sense of possibility as she began to understand the Kethmoran perspective. You're proposing some kind of alliance based on shared technological philosophies rather than traditional military or economic interests. Alliance concept too limited, Velandith said, her harmonics shifting to convey what the translation systems interpreted as gentle correction. We propose growth partnership. Consciousness-guided quantum manipulation combined with biological integration technologies creates possibilities beyond either species' individual capabilities. Symbiotic development rather than parallel development, Zethune added. Your quantum consciousness applications could enhance our biological integration systems. Our biological technology could provide new frameworks for your quantum manipulation techniques. Dr. Webb was frantically taking notes as he followed the conversation. They're talking about technological collaboration that could revolutionize both our approaches to advanced science. Sarah, this isn't just about military alliance against the Council. They're proposing something that could fundamentally change how technology develops in the galaxy. But such growth partnership requires freedom from Council entity restrictions, HYX pointed out. Council entity fears change potential beyond their control capacity. They will attempt prevention through force application. Sarah nodded grimly. We're aware of that risk. The Council is currently debating whether to invoke the betrayal protocols against humanity. If they do, they'll have legal justification to eliminate our entire species. Betrayal protocols represent Council entities' ultimate fear response, Velandith observed. But protocol implementation requires unanimous inner circle agreement. Current political patterns suggest uncertainty among several key species. You have intelligence about the Council's internal deliberations? Sarah asked with surprise. Kethmoran biological integration includes enhanced sensitivity to communication patterns, Zethune explained. We detect emotional resonances, stress indicators, certainty fluctuations in Council entity communications. Several species demonstrate significant uncertainty about appropriate response to human withdrawal. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. They're reading the Council's psychological state through their biological sensors. That's intelligence gathering at a level the Council probably doesn't even realize is possible. Which brings us to practical considerations, HYX said, her tone shifting to what the translation systems interpreted as serious focus. Council entity will likely approve betrayal protocols within 18 standard time units. However, protocol implementation requires fleet coordination from multiple species. Implementation timeline provides opportunity window. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What kind of opportunity window? Kethmoran defensive technologies include biological camouflage systems that render our vessels effectively invisible to Council entity sensors, Velandith explained. Combined with human quantum displacement capabilities, we could establish protected territories beyond Council entity detection range. Hidden colonies, Sarah breathed. Safe havens for species that want to withdraw from Council authority. Growth sanctuaries, Zethyun corrected. Locations where technological development can proceed without Council entity limitations. Where consciousness-guided quantum manipulation and biological integration technologies can develop symbiotic applications. Dr. Webb was staring at his notes with an expression of amazed comprehension. They're proposing to create an entirely separate civilization. Not just human colonies, but mixed species communities developing technology along completely different principles from Council mainstream science. But such growth sanctuaries require protection during establishment phase, HYX pointed out. Council entity will attempt location and destruction once they realize the scope of withdrawal movement. Sarah understood the challenge immediately. We need enough military capability to defend these sanctuaries while they're being established, but we can't match the Council's military might in direct confrontation. Direct confrontation unnecessary, Valandith said, her harmonics conveying what seemed like amusement. Council entity operates from predictable patterns based on fear and control obsession. We operate from growth patterns based on adaptation and innovation flexibility. Asymmetric advantage favors adaptation over control. Guerrilla tactics, Marcus said with sudden understanding. Not trying to match their military strength, but using our technological advantages to make conventional military responses ineffective. Biological camouflage combined with quantum displacement creates strategic invisibility, HYX confirmed. Council entity cannot attack targets they cannot locate. Cannot control territories they cannot access. Zethyun leaned forward, her form shifting slightly as her technological augmentations responded to her emotional state. But success probability requires additional partnerships. Other species demonstrate withdrawal interest but fear isolation vulnerability. Demonstration of survival viability required. Sarah felt the weight of opportunity and responsibility settling on her shoulders. You're saying that if we can prove that withdrawal from the Council is not only possible but actually advantageous, other species will follow our example. Cascade effect potential, Valandith agreed. Council entity power depends on universal submission assumption. Multiple species withdrawal creates authority legitimacy crisis that Council entity cannot resolve through traditional force application. Because if enough species withdraw, the Council stops being the galactic authority and becomes just another political faction, Sarah realized. Transformation from universal authority to competing faction status, HYX confirmed. At which point, growth-oriented species can establish alternative governance structures based on cooperation rather than control hierarchy. Dr. Webb looked up from his calculations with excitement. The mathematics work out. If we can establish successful independent colonies and defend them long enough for other species to see the benefits, we could trigger a complete reorganization of galactic civilization. But immediate challenges remain significant, Zethyun cautioned. Council entity enforcement fleet activities suggest preparation for major offensive against human territories. Time factor critical for sanctuary establishment. Sarah felt the urgency of the situation crystallizing around their conversation. How quickly could we begin establishing these growth sanctuaries? Kethmoran survey ships have identified 17 star systems beyond Council entity monitoring range, Valandith replied. Biological camouflage installation could begin immediately. Human quantum displacement technology could transport initial colony populations within days rather than months. And the defensive capabilities? Sarah asked. Biological technology integration includes adaptive shielding that responds to incoming threat patterns, HYX explained. Combined with quantum consciousness applications for threat prediction and response coordination, defensive effectiveness exceeds Council entity conventional weapons capabilities. Marcus was running calculations on his datapad as they spoke. The resource requirements are substantial but manageable. The real challenge is going to be coordinating multiple species evacuation from Council space without triggering premature military response. Coordination requirements suggest need for additional partnerships, Zethyun observed. Several species demonstrate interest indicators but require confidence-building demonstrations. Sarah thought through the diplomatic implications. We need to prove the concept works before we can convince others to commit. Which means establishing the first sanctuary with just human and Kethmoran cooperation, then using its success to attract additional partners. Risk assumption for greater opportunity potential, Velandith agreed. But, success probability enhanced by immediate action initiation. Council entity response patterns become more restrictive as time progression continues. They're saying we need to act now, Sarah realized. Before the Council votes on the betrayal protocols, before they can organize a coordinated response, before they realize the scope of what we're planning. Dr. Webb looked up from his calculations with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Sarah, what they're proposing isn't just about human survival. It's about fundamentally changing the entire basis of galactic civilization. We're talking about replacing a fear-based authoritarian system with something based on voluntary cooperation and shared technological development. Growth evolution versus stagnation control, HFY summarized. Pattern choice that will determine galactic development direction for millions of years. Sarah stood and moved to the meeting room's viewport, looking out at the stars that represented countless worlds under Council authority. Most of those worlds had never known anything except the system the Council had established, never imagined that alternatives might be possible. Growth pattern seeker Velandith, she said finally, humanity accepts your proposal for growth partnership. We're prepared to begin immediate establishment of the first sanctuary world. The harmonic patterns in Velandith's voice shifted to convey what the translation systems interpreted as deep satisfaction. Partnership initiation accepted. Kethmoran Surveyship Pattern Weaver will provide navigation guidance to sanctuary location. Biological camouflage installation begins immediately. Resource Flow Coordinator HYXMOTH will coordinate technology integration protocols, HYXMOTH added. Symbiotic Development Framework implementation starts within 4 standard time units. Zethun's technological augmentations began displaying complex patterns that Dr. Webb recognized as advanced mathematical sequences. Possibility Walker analysis indicates 73% success probability for initial sanctuary establishment. Additional partnerships could increase probability to 91% within 6 months. Sarah felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror as she contemplated what they were about to attempt. Dr. Webb, please send a priority message to President Vasquez through the Prometheus network. Tell her we're proceeding with Alternative Development Protocol 7. Marcus nodded and began configuring his quantum communication array. Alternative Development Protocol 7 was the code designation for humanity's most ambitious contingency plan, the establishment of completely independent colonies beyond Council reach. Until this moment, it had been considered a theoretical last resort. Captain Rodriguez, Sarah continued, please prepare Unity's voice for extended deep space operations. We're about to go places that aren't on any Council star charts. As the human and Kethmoran delegations began detailed planning for humanity's greatest gamble, neither group noticed the small, nearly invisible probe that had been monitoring their meeting from outside the station's detection range. The device belonged to the Nexari Intelligence Service, a species known for their exceptional espionage capabilities and their long history of selling information to the highest bidder. Within hours, complete records of the Human Kethmoran alliance negotiations would be in the hands of High Counselor Thexvar, along with detailed analysis of the technological capabilities both species had revealed during their discussions. The race between galactic revolution and Council suppression was about to begin in earnest, and neither side yet understood just how high the stakes had become. High Counselor Thexvar stood in the center of the Council's most secure briefing chamber, his 6 arms gesticulating with barely controlled fury as he addressed the holographic projections of the Inner Circle members. The chamber itself was a marvel of defensive technology, buried deep within the Council's primary station and protected by shields that could withstand direct stellar bombardment. It was here that the most crucial decisions in galactic history had been made, and it was here that the fate of humanity would be decided. Honored members of the Inner Circle, Thexvar began, his serpentine form coiling with predatory intensity. The intelligence we have received regarding the human situation has fundamentally altered the scope of the threat we face. This is no longer a matter of dealing with an isolated rebellion. We are confronting the emergence of what can only be described as a competing civilization. The holographic projection of Empress Kyalandris of the hegemony flickered with the aggressive patterns that indicated combat readiness among her species. High Counselor, your preliminary reports mentioned advanced technologies and an alliance with the Kethmarans. Please provide specific details. Thexvar activated the chamber's central display system, showing detailed recordings from the Nexari intelligence probe. 3 days ago, human and Kethmoran representatives met at the neutral station at Kepler 186f. During this meeting, they revealed technological capabilities that our finest scientists considered impossible and negotiated an alliance that threatens the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. The projection of Ancient One Velkareth, speaking for the Ethereal Council, manifested as shifting patterns of light that conveyed deep concern. Impossible in what sense, High Counselor? The humans demonstrated instantaneous communication across galactic distances and transportation technology that leaves no detectable traces in normal spacetime, Thexvar explained as technical readouts filled the display. Our analysis suggests they have achieved consciousness-guided quantum manipulation on a scale that exceeds our theoretical understanding by several orders of magnitude. Prime Coordinator Hesmiran of the collective pulsed with synchronized bioluminescence as their hive mind processed the implications. Such capabilities would render traditional military responses largely ineffective. Standard fleet tactics assume predictable movement patterns and communication delays. Precisely, Thexvar confirmed grimly. But the technological concerns pale in comparison to the political implications. The humans and Kethmarans are planning to establish what they term growth sanctuaries, independent colonies beyond our monitoring range where species can withdraw from council authority and develop technologies without our oversight. The chamber fell silent as the inner circle members processed this information. The concept of organized withdrawal from council authority was so unprecedented that most species had no cultural framework for understanding it. For 3,000 years, council membership had been considered as natural and inevitable as stellar fusion. How many species have they approached with this proposal? Asked Defense Minister ZYX Karis of the Expansion Fleet Command. According to our intelligence, Thexvar replied, they are currently targeting species with histories of friction regarding council policies. The Meridian Confederation, the Taurain Republic, the Independent Worlds Alliance, and at least 6 others have received preliminary communications from human diplomatic channels. Empress Kyalandris's projection shifted to display aggressive warning patterns. A coordinated withdrawal movement involving multiple major species would represent an existential threat to council authority. We cannot permit this to develop further. Which brings us to the immediate decision before this circle, Thexvar said, his voice taking on the formal tones reserved for matters of ultimate importance. I am calling for an emergency vote on implementation of the betrayal protocols against the human species, with immediate expansion to include all species that join their independence movement. Ancient One Velkaretha's light pattern shifted to convey what the translation systems interpreted as deep contemplation. The betrayal protocols have never been implemented against a species with advanced defensive capabilities. The humans' demonstrated technologies suggest that conventional elimination procedures may prove insufficient. Our fleet commanders have developed revised tactical approaches specifically for dealing with their quantum displacement capabilities, Defense Minister ZYX Karis responded. Saturation bombardment across multiple probability matrices should overcome their evasion systems. Prime Coordinator Hesmiran's bioluminescent patterns flickered with what appeared to be uncertainty. The collective requires clarification regarding the scope of implementation. Are we discussing elimination of human military forces and governmental structures, or complete species extinction? Thexvar's form expanded slightly, a sign of absolute determination among his people. The humans have demonstrated that partial measures are insufficient to maintain galactic stability. Their technological capabilities and alliance-building activities represent a fundamental challenge to the principle of council authority. Complete species elimination is the only response that adequately addresses the scope of the threat. However, interrupted the usually silent representative of the Nexus Foundation, such extreme measures may prove counterproductive. Our psychological analysis suggests that species currently considering withdrawal might interpret complete human elimination as confirmation of their concerns about council authoritarianism. Then, they would be correct, Thexvar replied coldly. The council maintains galactic stability through strength and unity. Species that choose to challenge that stability will learn the consequences of their choices. The only question is whether we act decisively now or allow this cancer to metastasize throughout the galaxy. Ancient One Valkaratha's projection brightened with what seemed to be alarm. High Counselor, the Ethereal Council has observed the patterns of galactic civilization for millions of years. Periods of forced unity through fear inevitably collapse when external pressures exceed the population's tolerance for oppression. The human withdrawal may represent the beginning of such a period. Are you suggesting that we should simply allow species to leave the Council whenever they become dissatisfied with our decisions? Thexvar asked with dangerous quiet. We are suggesting that flexible responses to changing political pressures may prove more effective than rigid adherence to dominance-based solutions, Valkarath replied carefully. Empress Kailandris's projection flared with aggressive patterns. The hegemony disagrees strongly with such weakness-oriented thinking. Strength maintains order. Compromise encourages further challenges. The humans must be eliminated as an example to other potentially rebellious species. Prime Coordinator Hesmiron pulsed with synchronized analysis patterns. The collective calculates a 67% probability that complete human elimination will trigger withdrawal attempts by at least 4 additional major species within 2 years. Alternatively, negotiated accommodation might reduce rebellion probability to 12%. Accommodation? Thexvar's voice carried the sharp edge that among his species indicated preparation for violence. Prime Coordinator, you speak as if the humans' demands were reasonable. They are not seeking minor policy adjustments or trade concessions. They are attempting to establish an alternative power structure that directly challenges Council authority. Defense Minister ZYX Karis activated tactical displays showing fleet positions throughout the galaxy. High Counselor, from a military perspective, immediate action provides significant strategic advantages. Our forces are currently positioned for rapid response to the human colonies. Delay will allow them to establish their defensive sanctuaries and, potentially, develop additional allies. Furthermore, ZYX Karis continued, our intelligence indicates that the humans are planning to begin sanctuary establishment within the next 72 hours. If we're going to act, it must be now. Thexvar surveyed the inner circle members with his compound eyes, reading the political currents that would determine the course of galactic history. The vote before us is clear. Do we implement the betrayal protocols against humanity and any species that joins their independence movement, or do we attempt negotiated solutions that may encourage further challenges to Council authority? The hegemony votes for immediate protocol implementation, Empress Kailandris declared without hesitation. The Expansion Fleet Command supports immediate military action, Defense Minister ZYX Karis agreed. The collective requires additional analysis time, Prime Coordinator Hesmiron announced, their bioluminescent patterns shifting to convey deep uncertainty. Current probability calculations suggest that all available options carry significant risk of unintended consequences. Ancient One Valkaratha's projection dimmed considerably. The Ethereal Council abstains from this decision. The patterns suggest that both action and inaction lead to fundamental changes in galactic civilization. We cannot determine which path leads to greater long-term stability. Thexvar felt his predatory instincts responding to the mixed signals from the inner circle. In his species' evolution, uncertainty among pack members had always been a sign of weakness that invited challenge from rival predators. 2 votes for implementation, 1 abstention, 1 request for delay. The decision requires a clear majority to proceed. High Counselor, came the voice of Trade Minister Yunthara of the Commercial Federation. The Federation requests permission to address practical concerns before voting. Proceed, Thexvar replied, though his tone suggested impatience. The human colonies represent significant economic assets, Yunthara explained. Complete elimination would remove approximately 18% of our advanced manufacturing capacity and 31% of our agricultural surplus. Additionally, the humans have developed several technologies that our industries have come to depend upon. Elimination would cause severe economic disruption across multiple sectors. Economic concerns are secondary to political stability, Thexvar responded firmly. Lost assets can be replaced. Lost authority cannot. However, Yunthara continued, the Federation has received preliminary communications from 17 species expressing concern about the economic implications of the proposed action. Several major trading partners have indicated that they may reconsider their commercial relationships with the Council if economic stability becomes compromised. Prime Coordinator Hesmiron's bioluminescence suddenly intensified with what appeared to be alarm. The collective has completed emergency analysis of the economic disruption scenarios. Probability calculations indicate a 73% chance of galactic recession lasting between 8 and 15 years if human economic contributions are eliminated simultaneously with potential trade relationship deterioration. Ancient One Valcaratha's projection brightened with renewed interest. Economic instability of that magnitude would likely trigger political instability throughout Council territories. Species facing economic hardship often become more receptive to alternative governance proposals. Thexvar felt his careful political calculations beginning to unravel as the complexity of the situation became apparent. What had seemed like a straightforward matter of disciplinary action was revealing itself to be a multifaceted crisis with implications that extended far beyond simple military response. Trade Minister Yunthara, he said carefully, what does the Commercial Federation recommend? Negotiated settlement, Yunthara replied immediately. Limited autonomy for human colonies in exchange for continued economic cooperation. Formal recognition of their technological capabilities in exchange for shared development programs. Political compromise that addresses their concerns while maintaining the framework of Council authority. Compromise that legitimizes rebellion, Empress Kailandris interjected angrily. Any accommodation of human demands establishes the precedent that Council authority can be challenged successfully. This will encourage every dissatisfied species to attempt similar negotiations. Defense Minister ZYX Karis displayed tactical projections showing potential conflict scenarios. Military analysis confirms the Empress's concerns. If we negotiate with the humans after they've declared independence, we essentially acknowledge that military force is not the ultimate guarantor of Council authority. This could destabilize our entire security framework. Thexvar found himself facing the most complex political crisis in Council history. Every available option seemed to carry the potential for cascading consequences that could fundamentally alter galactic civilization. Military action might succeed in eliminating the immediate threat but could trigger economic and political instability that would encourage further challenges. Negotiated settlement might avoid immediate conflict but could establish precedents that would undermine the entire basis of Council authority. The vote on betrayal protocol implementation is postponed pending further analysis, he announced finally. All Council departments are directed to provide comprehensive assessments of military, economic, and political implications within 48 hours. This session is adjourned. As the inner circle projections faded, Thexvar remained alone in the secure chamber, contemplating the holographic displays that showed human and Kethmoran ships already moving toward their planned sanctuary locations. The delay he had just announced might provide time for better analysis, but it also provided time for the humans to establish their defensive positions and potentially attract additional allies. For the first time in his long career, High Counselor Thexvar was beginning to understand that some problems could not be solved through the application of superior force. The humans had presented the Council with a challenge that was as much philosophical as political: whether galactic civilization would continue to be based on imposed order or evolve toward voluntary cooperation. The answer to that question would determine the future of every sentient being in the galaxy, and time was rapidly running out to find a solution that didn't lead to catastrophic conflict or the complete collapse of 3,000 years of galactic unity. Meanwhile, 16 light-years away, the first human and Kethmoran colony ships were already approaching a star system that existed on no Council charts, carrying with them the hope that an alternative to Council authority was not only possible but could thrive in the vast darkness between the stars. 6 months after humanity walked out of the Galactic Council, Ambassador Saracen stood on the observation deck of New Horizon Station, watching the most extraordinary sight in galactic history unfold before her eyes. The station orbited a previously unknown world that the human Kethmoran Alliance had designated as Sanctuary Prime, and the space around it buzzed with activity that would have been impossible under Council oversight. Ships from 17 different species moved in carefully coordinated patterns around the orbital installations. Meridian research vessels worked alongside human quantum tech platforms while Kethmoran bioships provided living computational matrices for calculations that no mechanical system could perform. The Taurain Republic had contributed their advanced materials science, creating hull compositions that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. Even species that Sarah had never encountered before had somehow learned of the Sanctuary Project and made the dangerous journey to participate in what many were calling the new cooperation. The integration is proceeding faster than our most optimistic projections, Dr. Marcus Webb reported as he joined Sarah at the viewport. His appearance had changed significantly over the past 6 months, with technological augmentations that represented a fusion of human consciousness guidance systems and Kethmoran biological integration. The result was a cybernetic symbiosis that enhanced his cognitive capabilities while maintaining his essential humanity. "How many species are we up to now?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. 23 confirmed participants in the Sanctuary Network, Marcus replied with obvious satisfaction. 47 others have established regular communication through the Prometheus Quantum Network. And, according to our intelligence sources, 61 species have formally withdrawn from active council participation without actually leaving the organization. Sarah nodded as she processed the implications of those numbers. They're creating a shadow network within council space. Species that are technically still members but are no longer participating in council activities or following council directives. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. The council's authority has become largely theoretical for nearly a third of their member species. They can't enforce compliance because they can't risk triggering mass withdrawals by implementing the betrayal protocols. The past 6 months had proven that humanity's gamble had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The first sanctuary world had been established without council interference, largely because the council simply could not locate it despite deploying their entire intelligence network. Kethmoran biological camouflage combined with human quantum displacement had created what amounted to an invisible civilization that existed parallel to council space without intersecting it. But invisibility alone would not have been sufficient to achieve what Sarah was witnessing. The true revolution had come from the technological cooperation between species that had been artificially kept separate by council policies designed to prevent exactly this kind of collaborative development. The consciousness-guided quantum manipulation we've developed with the Kethmorans is just the beginning, Marcus explained as he called up holographic displays showing their latest research results. When we added Meridian mathematical frameworks and Taurain dimensional manipulation, we achieved stable wormhole generation that requires only a fraction of the energy that council physics considered theoretically necessary. Sarah studied the technical readouts with growing amazement. "You're saying we've essentially solved the transportation problem that has limited galactic civilization for millennia?" "Not just transportation," Marcus replied with excitement. "Communication, resource extraction, defensive systems, even consciousness transfer across interstellar distances. The technological synergies we've discovered by combining different species approaches have created capabilities that no single species could have developed alone." "And the council still doesn't understand how we're doing it?" Marcus grinned. "According to our intelligence sources, their best scientists are still trying to figure out how we disappeared from their sensor net 6 months ago. They're approaching the problem from purely mechanical perspectives, trying to identify the energy signatures or technological principles involved. They can't comprehend that consciousness itself can be a fundamental force in physical interactions." Sarah turned back to the viewport as a new group of ships approached the station. These vessels bore the distinctive markings of the Zirian Collective, a species that had been among the Council's staunchest supporters for over 1,000 years. Their arrival represented perhaps the most significant diplomatic victory yet for the Sanctuary movement. "The Zirions finally made their decision," she observed. "Their entire governing council voted unanimously to withdraw from council authority yesterday," Marcus confirmed. "They're bringing their complete technological database and offering to share their advanced artificial intelligence systems with the Sanctuary Network." "What changed their minds?" Marcus activated another display showing intercepts of council communications from the past month. High Councillor Thexbar made the mistake of threatening them with corrective action when they requested modifications to the Trade Regulation 447C that eliminated the Valdorians. The Zirions realized that questioning any council policy, no matter how diplomatically, was now being treated as potential treason. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as she read through the communications. The Council's response to the withdrawal movement had been exactly what she had predicted, increasingly authoritarian measures that drove more species away rather than bringing them back into compliance. The Council is accelerating their own collapse, she said quietly. Fear-based authority systems always do, Marcus replied. The more control they try to exert, the more resistance they create. The more resistance they face, the more extreme their control measures become. It's a spiral that can only end in the system's complete destruction. Captain Rodriguez entered the observation deck carrying a secure communication pad. Ambassador, we're receiving a priority message from Earth. President Vasquez is requesting immediate consultation on what she's calling the endgame scenario. Sarah accepted the communication pad and activated the quantum link to Earth. President Vasquez's image appeared with perfect clarity despite the enormous distance, a technology that still amazed Sarah even after months of regular use. Ambassador Chen, President Vasquez began without preamble, we've received intelligence that indicates the Council is planning what they're calling Final Resolution implementation. According to our sources, High Counselor Thexvar has convinced the Inner Circle that the Sanctuary movement represents an existential threat that requires elimination through any means necessary. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Are they planning to implement the betrayal protocols despite the economic and political risks? Worse than that, President Vasquez replied grimly. They're planning something called cascade termination. Complete elimination of all species that have withdrawn from Council authority, followed by immediate occupation of their former territories to prevent economic collapse. Dr. Webb leaned into the communication range. Madam President, cascade termination would require coordinated fleet actions across hundreds of star systems simultaneously. That's beyond even the Council's military capabilities. Unless they're planning to use weapons of mass stellar destruction, President Vasquez said, her expression conveying the gravity of the intelligence she had received. Our sources indicate that the Council has been developing Starkiller technology in secret for over 2 centuries. Weapons capable of destabilizing entire solar systems. The observation deck fell silent as the implications of this information sank in. Even with all their technological advances, the sanctuary species could not survive the destruction of the stars around which their worlds orbited. However, President Vasquez continued, there may be an opportunity hidden within this threat. Our intelligence analysis suggests that several Inner Circle species are deeply uncomfortable with the proposed solution. The Ethereal Council has indicated privately that they will not support Starkiller deployment under any circumstances. How many Inner Circle members would need to oppose the plan to block its implementation? Sarah asked. 3 out of 7, President Vasquez replied. Which brings me to why I'm contacting you directly. Ambassador, we need you to do something that has never been attempted in galactic history. We need you to address the Inner Circle directly and present them with an alternative to mutual destruction. Sarah stared at the communication screen in shock. Madam President, no non-council species has ever been granted access to an Inner Circle session.